The black belt asked a black custodian to spar with him for amusement. What happened next? Quieted the whole combat sports facility. "Hey, you there wiping? How about a brief showcase?" yelled Marcus Thompson from the middle of the pad, his dark sash shining under the facility's bright lights. "I wager you've never witnessed a genuine bout in your existence, correct?" Robert Johnson halted, swabbing the ground, and gradually glanced up. At 42, he had been employed as a caretaker at that facility for just 3 weeks, always showing up after closing when the pupils had already departed. But on that Thursday evening, the expert sessions drilling had extended beyond the standard hour. "I don't wish to disturb you." "Instructor," Robert responded peacefully, going back to scouring a persistent mark on the tiles. "Just completing this so you can—" "Resume." Marcus let out a boisterous, dramatic chuckle that resounded through the facility. Everybody observed this, the fellows terrified to even tread on the pad. The 8 pupils there chuckled anxiously, some obviously uneasy with the scenario. What Marcus didn't realize was that Robert had devoted the past 20 years, attempting to totally erase who he truly was. 20 years since he exited the arena after a mishap that altered his existence eternally. 20 years concealing a mystery that not even his adolescent daughter knew about. "Come on, fellow!" Marcus persisted, nearing him with that haughty grin he employed to frighten novices. "Just a small showcase. I wager you don't even understand how to perform a fundamental defense. How about displaying my pupils the contrast between someone who drills and someone who just sweeps?" Robert sensed that familiar feeling in his torso, like a sleeping tendon being roused after years of dormancy. His gaze encountered Marcus's briefly, and for a split second, something transferred between them that made the teacher take an automatic step rearward. "Just an instructive showcase," Marcus pressed, now attempting to conceal the abrupt doubt in his tone. "Nothing too grave, just to illustrate the rookies why it's crucial to honor the combat discipline." Robert placed the pail on the ground and rose gradually. His motions had a smoothness that was odd for someone who had allegedly never trod on a dojo floor before. Around the facility, the pupil halted drilling, sensing that something was occurring. "All right," Robert said eventually, his tone serene like the exterior of a pond before a tempest. "But when we're finished, you're going to say sorry to all of them for converting the pad into a spectacle." Marcus chuckled, but this time the noise was a bit strained. "Say sorry, fellow. You're going to be the one saying sorry to the ground when you encounter it." What none of those individuals knew was that Robert Johnson had once been Robert Quiet Tempest Johnson, 5-time global blended combat disciplines victor. He had withdrawn at the peak of his profession after a mishap that claimed the existence of his closest pal and drilling companion. Since then, he had vowed never to battle again. But some vows are meant to be shattered when honor is at risk. If you're relishing this tale of surmounting hardship and fairness, don't forget to follow the platform to learn how a simple instant of bias would convert into the most degrading tutorial of Marcus Thompson's existence. Marcus adjusted, his dark sash with a showy motion, clearly relishing every moment of focus. "Everybody assemble around. You're about to observe a practical tutorial of why there is a structure in the realm of combat disciplines." Robert watched as the 8 pupils shaped a half-circle around the pad. Some appeared keen for the showcase, others clearly uneasy with the circumstance. A young Eastern woman, with her locks bound back, whispered something to her peer beside her, who just wagged his head in disapproval. "Look, everybody," Marcus persisted, motioning theatrically. "Here we have a flawless instance of someone who never grasped that there are suitable spots for certain kinds of individuals. Premier facilities are not for you know." Robert sensed that familiar sting in his torso, the same one he had sensed 20 years ago, when he overheard similar remarks about combatants who didn't appear like winners. The distinction was that now at 42, he had mastered to convert rage into energy for something much more potent than strikes. "Instructor Marcus," the young Eastern woman broke in shyly, "maybe we can proceed our usual drilling. It's getting tardy." "And Emily Park, are you doubting my coaching approach?" Marcus interrupted her harshly. "Settle down and observe. You'll grasp gain more in the next 5 minutes than in a month of standard drilling." Robert noted how Marcus used the girl's complete name, a clear exhibition of control. He also identified the expression of dread in her gaze, the same expression he had seen in the reflector 2 decades ago, when he awoke in a fright. recalling the mishap that claimed the existence of Anthony Iron Fist Garcia, his closest pal and drilling companion. Anthony had perished because of him. It was that straightforward. A series of strikes that Robert had hurled with excessive power during practice. Anthony dropped, struck his skull on the ground in a bizarre manner, and never roused. The probe concluded that it was a mishap, but Robert knew the reality. He had lost command because of the strain and the bigoted remarks from the crowd that evening. "So," caretaker Marcus jeered, "how about displaying my pupils how to perform a fundamental defense? Or is that too intricate for someone who only knows how to shove a swab?" Chuckles resounded around the facility, but Robert stayed still. His gaze shut briefly, and for a moment, he was back in that arena in Las Vegas, hearing the same sorts of remarks that preceded the disaster that altered his existence eternally. "What's the issue? Are you frightened?" Marcus pressed, now encircling Robert like a predator. "Or are you just going to remain there like a pole like you do with a wiper all day?" That was when Marcus made his first deadly error. He nudged Robert lightly on the arm, a seemingly innocuous contact, but one that bore all the conceit of someone who had never encountered real repercussions for his actions. Robert took in the nudge without shifting an inch. His soul stayed rooted on the ground like oak origins, and Marcus sensed as if he had attempted to nudge a cement barrier. The teacher's haughty grin wavered for a split second. "Intriguing," Robert murmured, more to himself than to Marcus. "It's been a while since someone attempted to taunt me like that." There was something in Robert's voice that altered the ambiance. It wasn't menace or fury. It was the terrifying serenity of someone who had traversed through much gloomier ravines and emerged altered. Marcus, unable to decipher the peril cues, doubled down. "Did you hear that, folks? He thinks it's intriguing. How about we display him the contrast between thinking and knowing?" What Marcus didn't grasp was that every demeaning word and motion was rousing something in Robert that had been sleeping for 2 decades. Not fury or a hunger for retribution, but something far more hazardous. The crystal-clear memory of who he really was when he stopped concealing. Emily Park watched the scene with increasing unease. There was something about the way the caretaker breathed, the way his tendons tensed almost imperceptibly, that reminded her of the films about big hunters she viewed on the Exploration Channel. The serenity before the assault. "Last opportunity, pal," Marcus announced, now clearly annoyed by Robert's lack of reaction. "Either you agree, the showcase like a gentleman, or I summon protection to guide you out. And guess what? You forfeit your position too." Robert opened his gaze gradually. When his stare met Marcus's, the teacher sensed a shiver run down his backbone, as if he had just roused a monster he thought was a harmless reptile. "All right," Robert said eventually, his tone low, but loaded with a command that made everyone there quiet instantly. "But when we're finished, I want you to clarify to your pupils why you converted a spot of education into a spectacle of degradation." Marcus chuckled, but this time the noise was anxious. "Clarify, fellow. You're going to have a lot of clarifying to do when you're on the ground." What neither of them knew was that Robert had devoted the past 20 years not only fleeing from his history, but refining an emotional command that had converted his former ruinous wrath into something much more polished and devastatingly potent. Each new degradation only fueled a mute power within him, a cold resolve that his former rivals knew well, but that Marcus was about to uncover in the worst possible manner. Marcus adjusted his position, clearly delighted with the respectful hush that had fallen over the facility. His 8 pupils shaped a perfect ring around the pad, some keen for the showcase, others clearly uneasy with the circumstance unfolding before them. "Everybody, you are about to behold a tutorial worth more than 6 months of drilling," Marcus announced showily, stretching his limbs like a performer. The contrast between those who commit their existences to combat disciplines and those who just well sweep the ground, where real combatants tread. Robert stood still in the middle of the pad, but something had altered in his inhaling. His gaze shut briefly, and for a moment he was no longer in that facility in Denver. He was back at the National Arena in Las Vegas 22 years ago, hearing identical remarks from the crowd before his global title bout against Victor the Wrecking Machine Ivanov. "Look at that little dark guy," someone in the seats had yelled that distant evening. I wager he won't endure 3 rounds against a real combatant. Robert had triumphed by technical stoppage in the second round, but the win had cost him dearly. The strain of the bigoted remarks had caused him to lose command during the following practice session, resulting in the accidental demise of Anthony Garcia. "So, caretaker," Marcus jeered, now encircling Robert like a hunter. "How about displaying my pupils how not to perform a fundamental defense? Or is that too intricate for someone who only knows how to shove a swab?" That's when Emily Park couldn't remain mute any longer. The 22-year-old Violet Sash in grappling and graduate pupil in athletics mindset had devoted the past 2 years recording instances of bias in athletics for her dissertation. What she was beholding was valuable scholarly material, but also deeply troubling. "Instructor Marcus," she broke in resolutely, "can I pose you a query? Why exactly do you believe it's required to degrade someone who is just performing his duty?" The hush that followed was stunning. Marcus gradually turned to Emily, his gaze narrowing with a blend of astonishment and annoyance. "Pardon me, Emily, but who's coaching the session here?" "You are," she answered peacefully. "But that shouldn't involve racial degradation masked as a skill showcase." Several pupils swapped anxious looks. No one had ever challenged Marcus like this before. The teacher sensed his cheeks burn. With a blend of wrath and shame, "Racial," Marcus chuckled forcibly. "This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with honor for the combat discipline and knowing your spot." Robert opened his gaze gradually. There was something in the way Emily had spoken, in the bravery of a young lady standing up to established control, that reminded him of his younger sibling Kendra. She had had that same resolve, that same rejection to accept unfairness mutely. Kendra had perished at 17, the casualty of a random projectile, during a law enforcement encounter in her area. Robert was rivaling in Japan when he got the update. Another individual he cherished lost while he chased fame in distant arenas. Another cause to desert everything and vanish into the plainness of an unidentified existence. "Emily," Marcus said in a perilously low tone, "if you can't honor my coaching methods, maybe you should seek another facility. There are spots more fitting to people with your outlook." The menace lingered in the atmosphere like poisonous vapor. Emily sensed a shiver run down her backbone, but she held her position. "My fees are settled, instructor, and I believe that everyone here merits an education setting based on shared honor, not degradation." That's when Robert did something no one anticipated. He began to grin. It wasn't an anxious or yielding grin. It was the gradual, computed grin of someone who had just discovered a motive to stop concealing. For 20 years, he had borne the burden of remorse for 2 demises that had indirectly resulted from his participation in the battling world. Now, beholding a courageous young lady defending values of fairness that he had deserted decades ago, Robert Johnson began to recall who he really was. "Marcus," Robert said eventually, his tone carrying a quiet command that made everyone in the room pivot to him. "The young woman is correct. This isn't about combat disciplines. It's about you attempting to feel significant by diminishing others." Marcus whirled on his heels, his cheeks red with outrage. "How dare you instruct me about combat disciplines? You don't even understand what a dojo is." Robert took a stride forward, and something essential altered in his position. His arms straightened, his center of balance lowered imperceptibly, and his soles placed themselves in a posture that any seasoned combatant would instantly identify as flawless. "Actually," Robert said peacefully, "I understand exactly what a dojo is, and I understand that this spot ceased being one a long time ago." Marcus sensed an inexplicable shiver run down his backbone. There was something about the way Robert shifted now, the way he filled the area that roused all of his instincts for survival. But his injured ego would not permit him to retreat. "Enough chatter," Marcus growled, taking his preferred battling posture. "I'll instruct you honor the tough way." Emily watched the scene with increasing worry, but also with expert interest. She had recorded hundreds of hours of practice and rivalries for her study, and something about the way the caretaker shifted reminded her of the grand experts she had examined in archival clips. The efficiency of motion, the managed inhaling, the serene presence that emitted contained might. Robert shut his gaze briefly and permitted 22 years of tendon recall to resurface. Every method perfected, every triumph secured, every tutorial learned in the most savage arenas in the world. When he opened them again, Marcus was looking directly into the gaze of Quiet Tempest Johnson, 5-time global blended combat disciplines victor. Last opportunity to say sorry. Robert offered kindly to her pupils, and to convert this spot back into an education area. Marcus chuckled, but the noise came out anxious and strained. Say sorry, fellow. You'll be pleading for pardon when you're on the ground. What Marcus couldn't perceive was that Robert had already spotted all of his skill flaws, the elevated defense that left his torso vulnerable, the inclination to withdraw with his right limb first, the way he announced his strikes with micro-shifts of his arm. 22. Years away from the arena had not erased decades of polished skill examination. Emily noted that other pupils were instinctively retreating like untamed creatures sensing an approaching tempest. Something in the vigor of the room had totally altered, as if the atmosphere had become electrically loaded before a bolt. It was when everyone chuckled at Marcus's latest jeers that something unforeseen began to form in Robert's expression. Not wrath or a desire for retribution, but the serene resolve of someone who had discovered a motive worth shattering a 20-year pledge of silence for. Some of those there began to grasp that something remarkable was about to occur, even without fully comprehending what their gaze were beholding. Marcus took his preferred battling posture, the one he had used to frighten hundreds of rookies over the years. Soles shoulder-width apart, fists gripped at torso level. Mass slightly ahead, the classic posture of someone who had mastered combat, disciplines in managed settings against foreseeable rivals. Robert stood still for a few seconds, simply watching. His gaze scanned Marcus from head to toe, automatically listing every skill detail. The elevated defense that left his flanks vulnerable, the unsteady foundation that jeopardized his equilibrium, the excessive strain in his arms that announced every shift before it even started. Still delaying, Marcus jeered, bouncing slightly on his soles. Or are you just going to remain there like a pole? That's when Robert did something no one anticipated. He began to shift. It wasn't a dramatic alteration, just a subtle repositioning of his soles, a slight lowering of his center of balance, his arms relaxing into a perfectly even line. But to anyone who knew what to seek, the change was immediate and terrifying. Emily Park sensed a shiver run down her backbone. During 2 years examining athletics biomechanics, she had examined hundreds of hours of footage of grand combatants. What she had just beheld was the shift from an ordinary man to a natural hunter, an alteration as subtle as it was ruinous. Intriguing, Marcus murmured, his assurance wavering for the first time. There was something about the way Robert filled the area now that roused all of his survival instincts. Robert took a stride forward, and Marcus instinctively retreated. The shift was so involuntary, so basic, that several pupils noted. A dark sash retreating from a caretaker. The authority dynamic in the room had totally flipped. Issue? Robert asked gently, his tone carrying a quiet command that quieted everyone. Marcus sensed the blood surge to his cheeks. His standing was being doubted in front of his pupils. He couldn't retreat now, even though every strand of his being was yelling at him to halt and say, sorry. No issue, Marcus answered, forcing a grin. Just appreciating your position. Did someone instruct you that on the internet? The quip fell flat. No one chuckled. The strain in the room had become almost touchable. Actually, Robert said peacefully, I mastered it at a spot called the Las Vegas National Arena. Maybe you've heard of it. Marcus frowned. The name sounded recognizable, but he couldn't locate the connection. Las Vegas. What kind of weekend seminar did you do there? Emily Park discreetly drew her phone out of her pocket and quickly entered. Las Vegas National Arena Combat Disciplines. What she discovered made her blood run cold. This wasn't just any prep course. It was where the world's greatest blended combat disciplines winners of the last 3 decades had drilled. Marcus, Robert persisted, his tone still serene. Last opportunity. Say sorry to Emily for doubting her right to speak. Say sorry to your pupils for converting this spot into a spectacle. And most of all, say sorry to yourself for becoming exactly the kind of individual that combat disciplines should instruct you not to be. The offer of mercy lingered in the atmosphere like vapor. Marcus could have selected modesty. He could have admitted that he had crossed a boundary. He could have preserved what little honor he had left. Instead, he assaulted. Marcus's first strike was skill flawless. A swift, precise jab, performed exactly as he had mastered in the guides. It was the kind of strike that worked against 99% of the individuals he had practiced with over the years. Robert wasn't in the 99%. The shift was so rapid, so smooth, that half of those there couldn't even handle what had occurred. Robert simply wasn't where Marcus's fist had been targeted. His form had glided to the side like liquid flowing around a boulder. And suddenly Marcus was off equilibrium, his limbs stretched into empty space. "Nice attempt," Robert remarked gently. "Already repositioned and perfectly equilibrated. Clean method, adequate velocity. But you announced the shift with your right arm." Marcus whirled wildly, trying to find his rival. How had someone shifted so swiftly? "Novice's fortune," he murmured, more to himself than to Robert. The second assault came in quick succession. Jab, direct, curve. 3 strikes linked together, with the accuracy of someone who had rehearsed the sequence thousands of times. It was his preferred series, the one he used to end practice sessions and awe rookies. Again, Robert simply wasn't there. This time, Emily managed to track the shift. Robert had lowered himself slightly, permitting the jab to pass over his skull by inches. The direct strike found only atmosphere when he leaned back in an impossible arc. And when Marcus hurled the curve with all his power, Robert took a small stride back, causing the fist to pass millimeters from his jaw. "Intriguing series," Robert noted, still inhaling evenly. "Works well against individuals who stand motionless. But you're leaving your left side completely vulnerable." After the curve, Marcus was starting to perspire. This wasn't normal. He had landed thousands of strikes in his existence, and now he couldn't land a single one on a man who had allegedly never battled before. "Stop evading in battle!" Marcus yelled, launching an even more forceful series. That's when Robert decided the showcase had gone on long enough. Marcus's third assault, a desperate series of strikes and kicks, found only atmosphere once again. But this time, something different occurred. When Marcus recovered after missing all his blows, Robert was inexplicably closer. "How?" Marcus whispered, realizing he had completely lost command of the gap. "Marcus," Robert said gently, now an arm's length away, "do you want to know the contrast between someone who mastered to battle in facilities and someone who mastered in expert arenas?" Before Marcus could respond, Robert did something that defied everything those there thought they knew about mechanics. Without appearing to use any power, without any abrupt or forceful shifts, he simply contacted Marcus on the torso with the palm of his right hand. Marcus soared. He wasn't shoved or felled. He was literally launched rearward as if hit by an unseen surge. His soles left the ground. He traveled nearly 2 miles through the atmosphere and landed on his back with an impact that made everyone in the room inhale sharply. The hush that followed was total. Marcus lay on the ground for a few seconds, gazing at the ceiling, trying to handle what had occurred. There was no ache, just the irresistible power of someone operating on a level completely different from anything he had ever known. "That," Marcus muttered, trying to rise. "That's impossible." Emily Park had stopped inhaling. In 2 years of examining combat disciplines, she had never beheld such a managed and ruinous display of might. There was no savagery, no wrath, just the clinical application of a method she had only seen in tales. "Actually," Robert said peacefully, extending to assist Marcus to his soles, "it's quite straightforward once you grasp leverage, timing, and energy movement. Principles I've mastered over a 22-year expert career." Marcus ignored the extended hand and rose on his own, his limbs still quivering. 22 years expert career in what?" Emily answered, her tone almost a murmur. "You don't grasp who he is, do you?" Everyone pivoted to her, who was still grasping her cell phone with the outcomes of her search. On the display, dozens of pieces, images, and clips confirmed what her instincts had already grasped. "Robert Johnson," she read aloud, "also known as Quiet Tempest. 5-time global blended combat disciplines victor. Considered one of the best skill combatants in history. Withdrew undefeated after a 22-year career, following a mishap that resulted in the demise of his drilling companion." The impact of the words hit the room like an explosion. Marcus sensed his cheeks go pale as actuality set in. He had challenged a living combat discipline's tale. He had publicly degraded someone who could have knocked him out with a casual shift. 5-time global victor. Marcus stammered, all his conceit evaporating instantly. Robert nodded mutely. "I withdrew at 29. Since then, I've been employed whatever positions I can locate. Sweeping, upkeep, plain positions, plain existence. No fame, no lenses, no need to demonstrate anything to anyone. The change in Marcus was immediate and painful to observe. The haughty man was gone, replaced by someone who finally grasped the scale of his ignorance. I didn't know, Marcus whispered. If you had known, would you have treated me with honor? Robert broke in gently. But would you still have degraded some other caretaker, another employee who had no credentials to protect himself? The query cut deeper than any physical blow. Marcus grasped that Robert had put his finger on the root of his real issue, not ignorance about his credentials, but the fundamental conceit that made him believe he could degrade people based on their occupations. Emily stepped forward, her tone resolute. Instructor Marcus, for 2 years, I have drilled at this academy out of honor for your expertise. But what I beheld today was not coaching. It was intimidation masked as guidance. Other pupils began to whisper in agreement. The disclosure about Robert had totally altered everyone's view on what they had beheld. Robert, Marcus said eventually, his tone loaded with a modesty no one there had ever heard before. I sincerely say sorry to you, to Emily, to everyone here. I have no justification for my conduct. Robert nodded, accepting the sorry with the same elegance with which he had mastered the physical encounter. Appreciated, Marcus, but sorries are only the first stride. The query is, what are you going to do differently from now on? Marcus looked around the room, seeing his pupils with new gaze. Some seemed let down in his conduct, others clearly reassessing everything. They thought they knew about honor and structure. I'll alter, Marcus vowed. It'll take time, but I'll alter. That's when Emily posed a query that surprised everyone. Mr. Johnson, would you contemplate coaching again? Because I think we could all gain a lot more from someone who grasps that true might comes with duty. Robert grinned, the first authentic grin anyone had seen from him that evening. Maybe, but not to coach battling methods. To coach something much more crucial, that honor isn't gained with sashes or titles, but with personality. As Marcus fully took in the most degrading tutorial of his existence, one query lingered in the atmosphere. Would one evening of modesty be enough to convert decades of conceit? Or would an even profounder alteration be required for true fairness to be delivered? 3 months later, the facility had been totally altered. Robert Johnson was no longer just the caretaker. Emily Park had persuaded the facility proprietor to employ him as a teacher specializing in expert methods and combat disciplines viewpoint. Marcus Thompson lost half of his pupils in the first week after the event. The clip Emily had discreetly captured spread across online platforms, showing a dark sash being degraded by a mere caretaker. His standing in the combat discipline circle was destroyed. Instructor Robert, Emily said after a session on honor and modesty. Thank you for coaching me that true might. Doesn't need to be shown to be acknowledged. Robert grinned, arranging the gear. The best tutorial I can coach is straightforward. Never assess someone by their occupation or look. Everyone bears tales that can astonish us. Marcus continued coaching at a smaller facility, but now with a modesty forced by public disgrace. He had mastered the tough way that conceit comes at a cost. Sometimes fairness comes mutely, like a tempest that alters everything without making a noise. Robert proved that true retribution is not ruining your rival, but showing that greatness comes from personality, not titles. If this tale moved you, follow the platform to uncover more tales about how remarkable individuals convert degradation into victory.